Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette. I think this is number 93. Well, number 93, I guess. We'll see. Let's find out. Let's find some philosophy to read. Because that's what we do here. We get a random philosophy paper. Although, I had a nice suggestion this morning from one of my previous papers reviewed. Boomer to Hugh, I think is how you say. So that was cool. If anyone else out there wants me to read something, I will take a look at it. I mean, the only thing is, it's going to be live on the air. Also, notes, I set the resolution up to, I think, 720p as opposed to 540. So, for all I know, this is a high def. I hope this computer can handle it. I don't know. Yeah. This is an old project box I had. And, it's very questionable, like, if anything can actually happen on it. Okay. Anywho, let's see what we got that's new today. Journal articles. American Catholic Philosophical Quarterly. Why not? Let's see. Read some Catholic philosophy. Catholic theology, I have to keep up. Review. Toward a broader construal of evidence. Okay. That's 14 pages. I might think about that. 12 pages. Aesthetic rationality. Ooh. Sounds cool. The Hart and Newman's See what is forthcoming now. See if they got a page numbers on it.
Sometimes, when it is cloudy.
No. Okay. So is this available?
Well do I remember the night of the great aurora, when over the swamp lay the
Nope.
shocking coruscations of the demon night.
No. Okay. Not gonna pay $20 to read this right now. I'm sorry, that looked cool, but moving on. Bioethics. Find out. Haven't read any. I don't know if I've read any bioethics. Seems like something that's very prescient nowadays. So. Oh, I did read something from these folks. I read this one right here. Ethical trend can turn it ought to a can. See what's forthcoming from them. The theory and practice of professionalism. I paid out of pocket for my son's circumcision at Happy Valley Tattoo and Piercing. Alternative framing of the debate over routine neonatal male circumcision. 2 pages. Yeah, see. So some of these are, yeah. Yeah, I wonder if there's, well, let's find out. This is a pandemic paper. So very, this is by Lawrence McCullough. In response, let's see. Not available though. Okay, too bad. Yeah, because the other paper I read from them was sort of there were very brief sort of comments on things that needed to get done. So it wasn't actually like a typical philosophy paper. Not that it was bad or anything, but it was just so short that it was the goal of the paper was not what I was expecting. So it's like, it was just sort of descriptive, not really arguing so much for a philosophical thesis, but of something that needed to get done within the profession. Which is fine, but like a very short thing like that. Alright, so let's see. We've got this paper here, and let's take a look. Yeah. And that's it right there. The unbearable whiteness of the mainstream. Should we eliminate or celebrate bias in bioethics? Well, who am I to complain about this? I'm going to read this one then. Sources of Normativity, How Multicultural Values Emerge by Nancy Ann Silbergeld Jecker. That's a fancy name, I think. Nancy Ann Silbergeld Jecker. Cool. Okay. If you join me live, and I hope you do one day, you can always pick up the link to this page right here by typing !paper in the chat box. Download, save file, open file. Cool. Cool. Open. And here we go. Okay, sources of normativity, how multicultural values emerge. I'd like to know that. Catherine Miser argues in Differences from Somewhere, the normativity of whiteness in bioethics in the United States, that previous efforts to highlight sociocultural diversity in bioethics fell short because they failed to problematize and displace white dominance and normativity. This, she contends, is necessary if diversity research is going to make a difference. In response, this paper explains why the sources of normativity matter. I first show why the sources of mainstream ethics and bioethics need concern us. I then consider Miser's proposal to do away with, displace mainstream bioethics, and render white bioethics problematizing. I give reasons for doubting that such an approach solves the problem at hand. Finally, I suggest an alternative strategy. This strategy appeals to Rawls's notion of a veil of ignorance and elaborates an interpretation of this approach that addresses the concerns Miser raises. Okay, the problem. Whiteness for Miser represents a marker of location or position within a social and racial hierarchy. White persons wield privilege and power within society, and more specifically within the scholarly field of bioethics. The dominant position of Western values in bioethics and ethics more broadly is problematic, according to Miser, precisely because its origins stem from the power and privilege of those who espouse it. According to the analysis she suggests, the source of normativity in bioethics is the universalization of a dominant white group's experience and culture and its establishment as the norm. Culture imperialism, rather than reason and reflection, yields normativity. Assuming that this analysis is correct, or even largely correct, it stands to reason that non-white persons who live under cultural imperialism find themselves defined from the outside. As others note, being defined from the outside implies being positioned, placed by a network of dominant meanings they experience as arising from elsewhere, from those with whom they do not identify and who do not identify with them. This creates the experience of otherness. Such an experience is fundamentally unfair because it is despotic. As Young expresses, the oppressed group's own experience and interpretation of social life finds little expression that touches the dominant culture, while that same culture imposes on the oppressed group and its experience and interpretation of social life. Yeah, that's what happens. One solution. One possible solution to this problem is to banish mainstream bioethics altogether. According to the approach suggested by Miser, white bioethics cannot be fixed merely by adding diversity and stirring. I like that. That's a funny little sentence. Yeah, just throw some diversity and stir up the pot. That's funny. Okay, this is because whiteness remains an unmarked or neutral category, while diversity remains marked and vulnerable to white acceptance. Rather than putting diverse moral values on equal footing, such as a strategy continues to assume that mainstream bioethics represents the norm. Only by putting down and displacing white talk can the whiteness of bioethics be seen as itself requiring some sort of justification. Only in this way can we mark white bioethics rather than assigning it to a neutral category. Yeah, because neutral is very often not very neutral. Because it's like if one thing is all equal, but then some things are less than equal. So the neutral then is not really neutral. It's still above all the less than neutrals. Okay. While initially appealing, such an approach encounters distinct challenges. It is in certain respects reminiscent of the strategy suggested by some feminists in response to the dominance of men's voices in ethics and moral philosophy more generally. Thus, Card argues against developing feminist ethics by reflecting upon existing ethical theory by male moral philosophers, criticizing, modifying, and extending it in light of feminist insights. She urges instead that women develop feminist ethics out of the raw data of women's experience, viewing their own lives as a starting point for moral theorizing. Yet the approach of starting anew takes for granted that women have raw experience unaffected by living in a world alongside men. Likewise, displacing white bioethics takes for granted, for example, that Latinos can invoke a purely Latino experience. It also sets up an oppositional account that focuses attention on differences at the expense of similarities. In short, it assumes that people of diverse cultures have little or nothing to gain from stirring and mixing, that is, from engaging together to see better their shared and different visions of the moral life. While recognizing that the history of bioethics and the Western moral tradition that forms its foundation is replete with bias, an alternative response is to find a voice in this conversation. In other words, to engage in the conversation that creates this history. This strategy has many virtues. Consider again the example of feminism. Even if women could cloister themselves and design moral theories for and about women, such theorizing would undoubtedly be impoverished by virtue of excluding men. I'm not entirely certain that you still want to. This is still sort of setting up the dichotomy this way, so I'm not entirely sure that this argument holds, because it's like, on the one hand, it's saying, well, the whole point of them excluding one class, the men in this case, was to get away from all the things that they thought were problematic, and then on this hand saying, well, you're missing out on all their experience, you're benefiting from it. Well, that was the point. It's like, yes, we're not going to do that for a little while just to see what happens and see if we can get something better. So of course, the more people you exclude, the more impoverished your theory is going to be, but sometimes it's like, well, sometimes you have to cut off a little bit to actually get somewhere new. So, maybe I'm arguing this is like an oversimplification of what's going on here. Okay, but let's see what the better solution is. A better solution. Let us explore the alternative strategy in further detail. Recall that the problem at hand is despotism in ethics and how to avoid it. Assuming a society marked by inequalities is it inevitable that values derive from persons with power and privilege in society? I'd say historically, sure. I mean, just as a historical note, yeah. I think it's a pretty, what do you mean exactly by inevitable? But I'd say it's like the vast majority of time, sure. If the answer is yes, and the source of normativity are fundamentally elitist, does it follow that ethics itself is tainted? Maybe. For example, does it follow that the values emerging from elite positions are unfair and reflect criteria of ethical goodness that advantage elite positions? Perhaps. Let us first explore other conclusions one might draw. One possibility is that ethics remains unsullied because elite members can succeed in rationally justifying fundamental values from the hypothetical position of a veil of ignorance. Not buying that. I mean, maybe, but it's unlike it just seems sort of ahistorical then. I mean, it's idealistic. Anyway, according to this familiar Rawlsian conception, hypothetical deliberators imagine that they are ignorant of their power and position in society. See, right there, how do you actually do that? They imagine, I mean, I'm in New York, and there's some very rich people, and and some of them are very delusional. Some of them aren't. But it's like, well, okay, it does sort of twist your mind. Whatever, if you're all the way to one side of the economic scale here, it's like you don't entirely understand the situation that other people are in. It's just you can imagine, but it's it gets farther and farther and farther away from your experience, so you have a harder and harder and harder time. So it's yeah, it's sort of it gets tough and from the other side too, of course. The other people can't understand everyone else's experience. Anyway, deliberators are thus prevented from tailoring principles to suit their own position, for no one knows his or her place in society. If a device such as the veil of ignorance can succeed, then elite individuals can formulate fundamental principles of morality by entering into an original position of equality with others. What the veil of ignorance hopes to accomplish is a filtering out of contingent facts about individual social position and natural talents or liabilities. As moral legislators unveil a veil of ignorance, Individuals devise principles that are valid for human beings as such. A little idealistic here. At least I'm not really buying that people who've had like lots of privilege actually understand what it is to be poor. Just doesn't seem realistic. Another less appealing possibility is that an ethics that emanates from power and privilege becomes corrupt. I'm not saying corrupt, I'm just saying it gets one-sided, and it's very hard to do to really appreciate other people's experiences if they're so far in from your own. According to this less favorable interpretation, the veil of ignorance accomplishes only an ingenious form of self-deception. It merely deceives the powerful and privileged into thinking that the values that flow from their elite positions can be fair. Or worse still, the veil is merely a tool used by the elite to deceive others, that is, to justify and maintain moral privilege and authority. According to these unfavorable interpretations, the sources of normativity remain elite, and the values emanating from such sources remain despotic. The veil, while in principle appealing, never succeeds in accomplishing its stated aims. Yeah, I think this is the more realistic option. Requirements for a better solution. How do we determine the merits of favorable versus unfavorable interpretations? Let us approach this question in the following way. Let us give the Rawlsian approach the benefit of the doubt, assuming that it is in principle possible for individuals of any social rank to enter into a veil of ignorance. You need a lot of education to at least understand something about other social ranks. So it's not so clear that someone from the in principle still requires a lot of background to even make sense. Okay, anyway. Let us ask the question, what conditions would be necessary for this to occur? One likely candidate is that to enter a veil of ignorance and an original position of equality with others, persons must be in the company of other deliberators. Why is this necessary? Perhaps because the presence of others in a moral conversation creates the possibility of awareness of the very special social and natural contingencies that the veil of ignorance covers. Such awareness might be necessary before the cover of the veil can be put in place. In other words, a person must see clearly what not to see. Yeah, this is incredibly difficult. How do you know what you can't see? A second possible condition for entering a veil of ignorance is that persons enter into this position with other moral deliberators who are unlike themselves. The rationale for this requirement is that if individuals deliberated with others who are socially and naturally indistinguishable from them, the veil of ignorance itself would seem superfluous. Equality would already reign among moral deliberators, and there would seem to be no need to take leave of our present predicament. Rawls takes the opposite tack. He assumes that social and natural inequalities exist, and that moral deliberators must be ignorant of these to enter the original position of equality. If other deliberators were merely clones of myself, the value of deliberating with others, the first condition, would seem irrelevant. A final proposed requirement for entering a veil of ignorance is that there is a shared human quality or qualities that survive the veil of ignorance. In other words, when persons enter the veil of ignorance, they must continue to exist as persons. Expressed differently, when social and natural inequalities are erased, there must be some of ourselves that survives and that we share in common with other human beings. Presumably, this will include the ability to reason. Perhaps it will also encompass moral feelings, such as the capacity for caring and compassion. Conclusion. Miser rightly notes that the authority of normativity requires an appeal to its sources. Looking to its sources, she uncovers white privilege and white supremacy. These sources she rightly regards as suspect. In concert with Miser, I have argued that values deriving from elite positions call into question the very foundation of mainstream bioethics. We must be concerned under these circumstances that mainstream values emanate from the self-projection of the privileged few and are applied despotically to the whole society. In contrast to Miser, I maintain that white bioethics and the larger multicultural conversation, of which it is a part, must coexist. Specifically, in a society marked by inequality, fair conditions for deliberating about moral principles must be met. One way of meeting these conditions is by means of a veil of ignorance. According to the interpretation I am suggesting, a veil of ignorance is entered by a community of moral deliberators, not by a single deliberator. The community of the composition of this community must be sufficiently diverse to avoid the problem of deception, in which the veil of ignorance functions merely as a tool to deceive others or oneself. Okay, so this is the crux of the argument right here. Sufficiently diverse to get so that you can have enough people to know what you don't know. That's tough. I mean, I like the suggestion, but that's a hard thing to know a priori. So how do you know you're not being a despot, really? You don't know. You're trying to be not despotic, and so, but you don't know exactly where this line is going to be drawn. Okay. In summary, if my reasoning is sound, the source of normativity are human beings. In contrast to religious or other non-natural sources of normativity, human sources do not possess inherent authority. Instead, human moral requirements gain authority by being fairly arrived at. A conception of the moral life gains authority to the extent that it can be shown to represent human beings like us. This will be possible only if multicultural individuals deliberate together, and only if, despite obvious differences, we share a common humanity. If we can find no common humanity, the idea of a veil of ignorance would simply obliterate the human person and defeat itself. Okay, yeah, it's a nice little article, showing that if you want to appeal to the veil of ignorance, sort of what could be done and why that matters for having multicultural values emerge in terms of normativity. I think my best comment was this little bit right here, what counts as sufficiently diverse. But other than that, it's like, this is not bad. It's an interesting little paper, and there's a question of how can we actually make use of the Rawlsian theory in terms of actually doing something worthwhile in terms of making bioethics more of a in terms of like diversity. How can you make bioethics more diverse, since inherently when we just draw stuff from the history, it turns out to be the benefit, it always turns out to benefit those who set it up that way, so, which is not good for everybody else. That's it for now, I guess. If you have any questions, let me know. I'd like to, of course, I had a nice suggestion this morning. Send me something to read. That's cool. I'll think about, maybe I'll come back in like half an hour and do another one, but I don't know, because I'll just come back tomorrow morning and do another one then. So I'll probably see you in the morning, and yeah, send me any questions, suggestions, things to read. I'd like to do it, and hopefully this actually worked, because I don't know how the I wonder if I'm actually in high def for once. So have a good night and stay safe, y'all. Bye bye.